If you have been studying paleomedia at any length, you would know that occasionally in children's books or even toys, there are creatures which remind you that the past was truly an alien planet. One of the top creatures which make one feel this way would perhaps be this lizard-like thing with a surrealistically long neck that is not a sauropod either. It is its own thing, doing its own thing by the sea, like a living lizard fishing pole. Tanystropheus. Today on the CM Kozeman channel, we are going to dive deeper than anybody has into the mystery of this animal, and we are actually going to examine its entire family group as far as we know them in September 2025. Welcome everyone to the CM Kozeman special on Tanysauria, the reign of the long lizards. Before beginning, I would kindly like to remind you that this channel is not monetized and it keeps going only thanks to your donations on Patreon. If you like this video and if you want to see more of my dinosaur art, my surreal art, downloadable sound recordings of these podcasts, and much more, please kindly consider supporting me on patreon.com/cmkozeman. Every penny makes a difference. With that out of the way, let's get cracking on the tanisaurs. Now, Tanysauria is the name given to the clade containing the famous Tanystropheus and a bunch of others. And this group had its heyday in the middle to late Triassic epoch. So they were on their way out just as the first dinosaurs were strengthening their dominion over the planet. Initially, Tanystropheus and a few others were classified as part of the quote-unquote Prolacertiformes group, a big clade containing many oddballs such as the strange tree-climbing Drepanosaurs, the wing-backed Longisquama, and a few others. And only recently were all these creatures which you're about to see were properly put into one consistent clade known as Tanysauria. Now, the problem with cladistics is that it catalogs organisms by their lineages of descent, so it's a proper family tree. So it works best and gives the best results when you have actual genetic information to categorize things by. In fact, in the last 20 years, cladistics underwent a revolution in the classification of still extant lineages such as reptiles, birds, mammals, and others. But with fossils, we are still forced to do cladistics in the old-fashioned way. That is to say, we measure bones really hard, we assign many characteristics to them, measure them, codify them, and get computers to crunch the numbers and give us family trees. But no matter how hard we use computers or define characteristics or crunch out numbers, our cladistic efforts with fossils are forever doomed to be educated guesses, because there is always the risk of two creatures looking alike because of convergent evolution, and also there is always the risk of the fossils being interpreted wrongly. There is always the persistent cloud of error resulting from fragmentary fossils, crushed and disarticulated bones, and so on and so forth. These problems get even more intense during periods of intense evolutionary diversification, such as the Triassic period, already famous for a lot of oddball clades rapidly filling up ecological niches after the Great Permian extinction. So suffice it to say that this cladogram you see here represents our best knowledge as of 2025, but it might change in the future. In fact, I have a nagging suspicion that the entire group is polyphyletic, that is to say, it contains some animals that do not descend from others, but simply look that way due to convergent evolution. But who am I to say? Anyways, it's good enough for government work, as they say. It's bon pour l'Orient, good enough for the East. So let's get cracking with our deep dive into Tanysauria. To begin with, what the heck are these tanisaurs? Well, as I just told you, things are always a bit hazy, but we now think they're a cousin group to all the other archosaurs, that is to say, relatives of crocodiles, dinosaurs, birds, and also a few other oddball groups such as rhynchosaurs and trilophosaurs. Okay, so all of these fall into one side, and our good friends, the tanisaurs, are an outgroup that splits off from that great big lineage. Now, the clade itself is divided roughly into two major subclades, Trachelosauridae and Tanystrophidae, but there is an outlier that seems to represent the most ancestral condition of the entire clade, and that is Jesairosaurus. It is an unassuming creature with a low and long skull and largish eyes, but characteristics in Jesairosaurus' skull, its forelimbs, its scapula and shoulders and neck vertebra kind of place it into this group. Unlike the legendary long necks of its later cousins or descendants, Jesairosaurus has a pretty short neck, and its name refers to the Arabic name for Algeria, Jezair, which honors its home country. It was found in the southeastern Illizi province of Algeria, which, as you can see here, is a really beautiful place. But keep in mind that the classification of these guys is always very shaky. You may wake up tomorrow and find out that Jesairosaurus is not even in this group. So always keep that in mind. Let's move on into Tanysauria proper. Take one more step into the Trachelosauridae clade and start our study of that group with Austronaga. Austronaga was described earlier this year from China. In it you can already see the basic characteristics of the group developing. It's got a sharp snout lined with pointy teeth. It had largish eyes and probably a long neck, we don't know cause it's cut off, and a very long tail. It looks really impressive, but study the scale bar in these pictures. It was a really tiny creature. It could probably sit and rest inside your hand and was generally nifty like that. Let's move on to a relative, Pectodens. The name means comb tooth, pecten meaning comb in Latin. It is known from a quite well articulated fossil unearthed in China in 2017, and it really has a strange mix of characteristics. There is once again a long and clearly defined neck, long and quite robust limbs that suggest this guy was probably actually very terrestrial, unlike some of its descendants or later cousins, let's say, and its teeth were really strange, thin and densely packed, like, well, the teeth of a comb, suggesting that whatever it was doing, Pectodans was already very specialized for a unique lifestyle. Maybe it ate a certain type of arthropod that was best caught with teeth like that. Maybe it was even a filter feeder like some bizarre reptilian quasi-flamingo. Maybe it used its long limbs to climb trees and catch and eat something. We just don't know. But it was really unique, beautiful, and nifty. In fact, if this creature and if a lot of its relatives, if they were alive today, they would probably be featured in my favorite YouTube channel of all time, Clint's Reptiles. And once there, I think Clint Lairdlow would say that Pectodans and all the others would make quite rad pets. Anyways, moving on, we have Fuyuansaurus, also known from China. It is known from a fossil that is somewhat smashed and torn apart, almost like a prehistoric roadkill. That makes it kinda difficult to classify. Some family trees remove it from the Trachelosauridae branch and place it into Tanystropheidae, but you gotta get used to this sort of thing if you're studying a group like this. Now, one side note in this entire presentation is that I am presenting you with actual images of fossils and not as many reconstructions or colorful fancy works of paleo art as one might like. I am doing this on purpose because usually these fossils are all that the researchers have to work with. It's not a case of your guess is as good as theirs, but I want you to appreciate prehistoric animals through the fossils, and maybe you will thank me later. Let's move on deeper into the Trachelosauridae clade, and now we have Trachelosaurus, the animal which lends its name to this subclade. Trachelosaurus is known from a blown up looking fossil recovered in 1917 in Germany. Originally it was called Conchiosaurus, and currently it is understood to be a more aquatically adapted member of this clade. It was a small but long-necked and long-tailed swimming animal, much like a tiny plesiosaur almost. Here you can see something strange happening in this clade. The less derived forms had more terrestrial adaptations, longer legs, more lightly built necks. But once you move past Trachelosaurus, the adaptations pivot to an almost entirely aquatic existence. The neck and tail get longer and heavier. The leg bones become thick, acting like ballast to help the animal sink in water, and an interesting evolutionary specialization is going on. If you look at the next species in our family tree, Gracilicolum, you can see the neck bones getting more flexible, and they are developing these long flanges which probably help support an expansible throat region. Here you can see Gracilicolum chilling underwater in this great illustration by amazing paleo artist and my good friend Joshua Knuppe. Gracilicolum's adaptations are carried to a maniacal extreme in the next creature in our family tree. Behold, Dinocephalosaurus. The name means terrible-headed lizard, and it is simply an incredible animal. Discovered in China and described in 2003, some specimens of Dinocephalosaurus grow up to 5 meters long. Not only did Dinocephalosaurus have an obscenely elongated neck, deceptively similar to its maybe relative Tanystropheus, it had a long body and a long tail too. We are going to make a deeper comparison with Tanystropheus when we examine that species later on, but unlike Tanystropheus, Dinocephalosaurus grew its long neck by adding more neck vertebra. Its head was also unique, flattened with lots of jagged teeth, jutting above and below its jawline. Its limbs were small, flattened, and made out of very dense bones, and almost certainly were at this point covered by fins. You probably could not see its individual digits when the animal was alive. And this is a drastic derivation from ancestors like pectodens, which, as you remember, had long, thin and muscular legs which were suited for a terrestrial existence. Dinocephalosaurus also probably gave birth to live young, as we can tell from an embryo preserved in a similar fossil. Whether this was Dinocephalosaurus itself or not is a moot point. It just goes on to show that this lineage had evolved viviparity, that is to say, live birth, which must have aided their life in the sea. They were proper marine reptiles now. Because of its many well-preserved fossils and its extremely strange body form, Dinocephalosaurus is something like a paleo weirdo superstar at the moment. You can see many works of paleo art depicting it, and they even have its action figures for sale from the famous PNSO Prehistoric Animal Company. What this animal did in life and how it fed remains a mystery. I personally suspect that its big throat, supported by those umbrella spoke-like bones anchored to its neck vertebra, was somehow able to expand suddenly, creating a suction feeding mechanism, not unlike those of mata-mata turtles or giant Japanese salamanders living today. But Dinocephalosaurus must have taken this sudden lunge suction feeding adaptation to an extreme. I can really picture one lying in the shallows or among some rocks in some long distant prehistoric ocean. Maybe there's a fish swimming near it, and suddenly this monstrous creature lunges up from the sea bottom or from among the rocks. In a millisecond, it expands its throat like an empty sock or a big tube. Water floods into the expanding throat and draws the unfortunate victim in. As it flushes the water back out from its mouth, the long jagged teeth ensure that nothing slips out. With such adaptations, maybe Dinocephalosaurus employed this lunge suction feeding mechanism on large multitudes of tiny prey animals as opposed to single large prey items. Or maybe it took a bit of everything. What do you think? If you can't support me on Patreon, at least answer my bait questions so we get some engagement going on in this channel. But yeah, Dinocephalosaurus and the closely associated Gracilicolum really give me headaches. Maybe they don't even belong in Tanysauria proper, but were in fact related to one of the many aquatic reptile clades alive at the time. You had things like pistosauroids, pachypleurosaurs, and notosaurs all swimming around in the world's oceans around the same time as Dinocephalosaurus, and maybe its long-necked Tanystropheus-like look is just a case of convergent evolution. But yeah, the entire diversity of these marine reptiles, which group begot which group, which is related to which, is all a bit of a headache, and I'm not even gonna go too deep into those waters at the moment. Let us instead soothe ourselves with comfortable certainties offered by this paraphyletic cladogram, that is the diversity of Tanysauria, and here we have completed our overview of the trachelosauride group. We are now moving on to the Tanystrophidae clade, which houses the more familiar Tanystropheus and its own equally bizarre, independently evolved long neck. Let's skip from Trachelosauridae into Tanystrophidae proper, and our most basal species is Augusta burriania. This is a scantily known species, but the weird neck vertebra we have are enough to mark it off as a Tanystropheus or relative. It was discovered in Russia in 2011, back when Tatu was still a relevant pop band. Next up, we have Luxisaurus, another fragmentary dude. This time the fragments we have come from its legs and parts of its pelvis and tail, and already we can see that this was a more terrestrially adapted creature with long and robust legs. We have no idea about its neck, but chances are it was quite longish like its relatives. Luxisaurus is known from South China, and that's it. Next we have a very famous species, actually a genus with 3 distinct species, Macrocnemus or Macrocnemus, however you spell it. It is known from extensive fossil remains. This one is Macrocnemus bassani. It's got a lightly built skull and long legs. It was in life, I am sure, a really cute, almost Star Wars creature-like animal. A reptilian, slightly bird-like equivalent to an aquatic cat, perhaps. I mean, look at these fossils. You can't convince me that this thing was not playful. Another species is Macrocnemus obristi, known from Switzerland, the home to my friend and sometimes co-host on this channel, TK Sivgin. And from China we have Macrocnemus fuyuanensis with a slightly more robust set of jaws and slightly more crushing teeth. If you compare this with the teeth of Macrocnemus bassani, you can see that bassani had sharper, more recurved and grasping teeth. Here's another picture of Macrocnemus fuyuanensis. The blunt teeth are once again visible, suggesting that perhaps it fed on a more crunchy, durable sort of prey. There is something really weird, cute and characteristic about this animal and its relatives, and their lifestyle is always a bit of a mystery. On one hand, they are very lightly built, almost like tiny lizard dinosaurs with narrow pelvis, but then again they are known from seaside remains, and in one case we have evidence of Macrocnemus or a very near relative being torn apart by another marine reptile known as Nothosaurus. Now these all paint a picture of these things being active hunters of insects and small prey that were also quite willing and able to enter water and hunt there, almost like little frog lizard things. Their long legs, while slim and suggestive of terrestriality, could have also been useful in a strange frog paddle-like of swimming which probably has no analogues left today. And that's one of the ideas I want to drive home about this group in general. These things were freaky, but they were not freaks of nature. The entire Tanystropheid group lived for quite well over 30 million years. That's a long geological time by any measure, so they must have been really successful at what they were doing. But what they were doing must be the question. It seems like these animals inhabited an ecological niche that does not exist anymore. And you must always remember this. There are ecological niches today. It is very easy to classify animals living or past. You know, you look at their body forms and anatomies and you say, that's a small predator. Okay, these were herd-dwelling herbivores. Okay, that's an armored guy. You know, the giant Glyptodon occupies the same niche that the ankylosaurs did. But always remember that there must have been niches that have no equivalent left today. Maybe because of a prey item, a plant or a habitat, these animals must have done something that nothing else can do ever again. Conversely, the bizarre anatomy of Tanystropheus and relatives may instead reflect the absence of a competing body plan which has evolved since then and cannot de-evolve afterwards. You cannot put the evolutionary genie back into the bottle. What I mean by this is perhaps the absence of flying seashore animals during that part of Earth's evolutionary history may have allowed Tanystropheids and relatives to do things that they just cannot do now. Maybe they were doing the cormorant or seagull thing without wings. If an animal tried to evolve in the same direction today, or perhaps even later in the age of dinosaurs and during the late Triassic even, they would be chased out or eaten by flying seaside pterosaurs or birds. But back in that sweet spot of the early to middle Triassic, maybe the Tanystropheids had the entire play field to themselves, so to speak. So that was that, and now back to our discussion of Macrocnemus. In paleoart, this is always a delightful animal to represent. You have been seeing pictures cycling in the background for a while. One of the cutest depictions I know is this model, which bears an uncanny resemblance to the 1990s computer game character Gex the Gecko. Another painting which has moved me almost to the point of tears actually is this beautiful rendition of two Macrocnemus playing near a seaside cave by the inimitable master artist Douglas Henderson. There's just something magical about this painting, and I'm just gonna let you watch it with the accompanying soundtrack for a while. You can almost picture yourself there. The little reptiles running and playing in the wet sand, caves echoing with the sound of unseen strange animals, and the soft lapping of the waves. This painting also strikes a personal memory. I remember being a kid, and I don't even know where, but I am on the seaside. I am pretending I'm a dinosaur. Don't laugh, you insensitive bastards, okay? I'm pretending I'm a dinosaur, and it's a very long sandy beach, and I just keep running there as fast and as fast and as fast as I can. And, well, you know, these are all the bittersweet childhood memories which will never come back, but which will nevertheless sustain you throughout the rest of your life. And yes, that was just a little personal note on that behalf. Okay, let me wipe my tears and actually go to an emergency. Yes, everybody, there has been an emergency while I was recording this podcast, and just before I wrapped everything up, a relative tentatively placed close to Macrocnemus has been described. We don't have many pictures of this guy. It is called Tanystropheus. It is a Macrocnemus-like tanystropheid known from these eccentric vertebrae that bear little spikes on them. So we now think, and you can see it in this incredible artwork by Joshua Knuppe, that this was a sort of spiny-backed relative of Macrocnemus and other tanystrophids. This animal was also ridiculously small, not over 20 centimeters long snout to vent. So once again, if it was alive today, somebody somewhere would be keeping it in a terrarium. Next up, we have the fragmentary fossil UFRGSPV492. There's not much about this fossil, but it places Tanystropheus-like animals to South America. Its identity is really not certain, so don't be surprised if this turns out to be something else in the future, but at least tentatively, we can say that it is evidence showing that these animals were really widespread in their time. As we climb higher in the Tanisaur cladogram, next up we have Amatosaurus, once again a scattered and fragmentary guy. Nevertheless, it preserves some key evidence identifying it as a tanystropheid relative. It is known from Germany, and basically that is that. Our next Tanisaur, thankfully, is not as fragmentary. Behold Langobardisaurus, a very unique and distinct species known from some very cute specimens. I mean, just look at these guys. They're like little flappy reptile penguin things, little man things that run about on very long legs. But the real distinction of Langobardisaurus is in its skull. Note that it has a very, very strange dental arrangement. The top part of its mouth is sharp and almost beak-like. There are some pseudo-tooth-like serrations in the beak too. Then moving backwards on the skull, you notice these teeth that are strangely cusped. They have 3 cusps, as if they were evolved to deal with some sort of crunchy prey that needed gripping. And then in the hindmost part of the mouth, we have these really long, shearing/crushing teeth that really have no equivalents elsewhere in the reptile family tree, whatever reptile means at this point, of course. It was clearly doing something unique with its lifestyle, probably feeding on a distinct form of crustacean or hard-shelled mollusk prey. That great big teeth it had at the back of its mouth almost certainly helped it roll back and crunch whatever it was eating, and the long forceps-like beak almost certainly helped it tweezer out something from among that pulpy mess it made after cracking open its prey. Langobardisaurus comes in several species, and it's known from fossil deposits in northern Italy and the surrounding regions. It's a European oddity. And if you know a thing or two about the evolutionary history of archosaurs in general, you will know that around the same time and nearly the same place, there lived another group of animals with similarly weird dentition. Yes, I am of course talking about the earliest pterosaurs. Now, pterosaur evolution is really strange, and we still cannot pin down how they originated. And to make things weirder, the earliest pterosaurs had skull and dental arrangements unlike anything that came before or after them, with the exception of Langobardisaurus and a few other oddballs, of course. Now, if you were a moron, you could jump to the conclusion and immediately say that, oh, this is proof that the pterosaurs originated from among the Tanystropheids, or maybe they even share the common ancestor. And I mean, to your credit, yes, the skulls of both animals are in a strange way similar, but when you study their anatomy in further detail, you notice that this is just a case of convergent evolution. It actually shows you something more profound. It shows that there was a very rich and untapped food source near the seas during the early to mid-Triassic. This was such a bountiful resource that it made the evolution of animals as outlandish as Tanystrophids possible and sustainable. Whatever these things were, at that time they were not threatened by any marine reptiles or flying predators or anything else. Quite possibly they were related to mollusks, or maybe it was a wayward and extremely prolific kind of crustacean. Whatever it was, it should make you circle back to my previous notion of there being niches that no longer exist today, and the potential of unexploited resources as a crucible for the evolution of really weird body plans. But let us move on with our family tree survey of tanisaurs, and next in line we have another fragmentary guy, Raibliania, from northern Italy again, a very fragmentary fossil which was closely related to Tanystropheus, and maybe was even a species of Tanystropheus itself. Let's move on again. Here is the superstar, the megastar, the end-all be-all charismatic animal that defines this entire clade, Tanystropheus. When it was first discovered, Tanystropheus was actually mistakenly interpreted as a flying reptile related to pterosaurs. It was called Tribelesodon. The long bones that made up its neck were thought to be the long finger bones of a sort of wing arrangement that supported a gliding membrane. The researcher responsible for this interpretation, by the way, was none other than Baron Franz Nopska von Felsus-Silvas, also known as just Franz Nopska, one of the monumental eccentrics who left his mark in the history of early 20th century paleontology. I could make an entire big podcast about the life of this guy, but for now, suffice it to say that he was a member of the Hungarian nobility and then experienced all the transformations of the Gilded Age and its terrible aftermath. He was singularly interested in Albanian culture and history. He had numerous adventures and misadventures among the feudal lords and in the mountains of pre-independence Albania. And finally, when Albania won its independence from the Ottoman Empire, he actually volunteered to be king of the Albanians. And then when his would-be subjects asked him, "But sire, where will we find the money?" To this he replied, "Oh, fuck it, I'll just figure it out. I'll just marry some rich American girl or something." God damn. I'm really not making this up. I'm gonna read you his exact quote on this matter, and it's just like ridiculous and tragic at the same time. "Once a reigning European monarch, I would have no difficulty coming up with the further funds needed by marrying a wealthy American heiress aspiring to royalty, a step which under other circumstances I would have been loath to take." He would have been loath to take that step because Nopska was also a gay man in an age which did not understand or tolerate such relationships, and he had a famously convoluted and troublesome mental health too. He had a secret lover, Bayezid Elmas Doda, who was a skilled ethnologist and author and also a photographer in his own right. And unfortunately, when he was suffering a particularly horrible bout of depression, Nopska killed this guy and committed suicide, which goes to show that being an outsider, being an eccentric, being a non-normative person always skirts dangerously close to the darker parts of the human psyche, but at the same time, having such a mental composure allows you to see things that other people cannot readily see. Because Nopska was not just a pure eccentric, he was also really ahead of his time in terms of paleontology. He was one of the first people to suggest that dinosaurs may have been warm-blooded and ancestral to birds. Remember, he was working in the 1920s and the 30s. And also he was one of the first scientists to study dinosaurs not as geological bone specimens, but as organisms which were parts of ecosystems and which were biological creatures in their own right. So a really interesting character all in all. If you are interested in learning more about the life of Franz Nopska von Felsus-Silvas, the book I can recommend you would be this one, Traveler, Scholar, Political Adventurer, a Transylvanian Baron at the Birth of Albanian Independence, The Memoirs of Franz Nopska, published in 2014 and edited and translated by Robert Elzy. This really is the go-to book about this person, and as a general rule, I always recommend looking into the lives of the people who discovered your favorite creatures. You may come up with some pretty tragic stories, but there will certainly be no shortage of adventure. But yes, we were talking about Tanystropheus, weren't we? Okay, so Tanystropheus is known from a lot of specimens and quite a number of species and maybe even subspecies. The smallest ones are nearly a meter long, so much like those earlier cute seaside reptiles we've seen. But the largest ones are arcane, bizarre monsters, up to 6 meters long, with half of that length being made up by their long, surrealistic necks. The necks were made out of a small number of very long bones like these ones, which is why they were at first confused with the wing fingers of a pterodactylus-like creature. Now, at the either end of its neck, that is to say, where the neck joined the body and where the neck joined the head, Tanystropheus also had smaller, shorter vertebrae, which afforded its mouth some extra flexibility and wriggle room. Now let us examine some fossils of these amazing creatures. Generally, as a basic rule, the smaller specimens are classified as Tanystropheus longobardicus, such as these ones here. You can note that they had a shorter face and larger eyes comparatively. And the gigantic specimens are classified as Tanystropheus hydroides, and they had a longer mouth with some flatter head profiles and bigger jutting teeth, superficially similar to Dinocephalosaurus. Here's a slide comparing both of their heads together, and at once you can see that maybe this similarity between the overall body shapes of Dinocephalosaurus and Tanystropheus is actually a case of convergent evolution, because as similar as they may look, you notice that their nostrils, the overall arrangement of their jaws, and the overall placement of the skull bones within the bite are quite different. Tanystropheus, for example, has fused nostrils and a large dish-shaped depression above its nasal area, whereas Dinocephalosaurus seems to have this duck-like flattening of the four parts of its skull. Their bodies are also not as similar as one would like to think. As we've seen in earlier slides, Dinocephalosaurus actually had shorter fin-like limbs which were probably encased in some sort of fleshy, loby fin, whereas Tanystropheus had longer, more articulated limbs. Maybe they had some webbing still, but they were nothing like the paddle limbs of Dinocephalosaurus. As a side note, we also have lots of fossils of Tanystropheus that were found to be decapitated or with broken necks, suggesting that this was becoming an easy prey for some larger predators as its reign drew to a close. Now, there have been lots of hypotheses about how this animal moved and swam. Some people suggest that it may have used a weird frog paddle-like swimming stroke. In the past years, there have also been hypotheses suggesting that this animal had like a chunky mass of flesh near the base of its tail and the hind parts of its body, suggesting that it had some junk in the trunk to maybe help counterbalance the neck. Later studies may or may not have discredited this claim. There was also one study suggesting that maybe it was capable of dropping its tail like a lizard, but then again, to the best of my knowledge, I think this was a questionable claim too. Suffice it to say, despite being represented by a lot of fossils, we still cannot get a clear picture of what Tanystropheus looked like. Maybe it was a mostly marine reptile with a unique swimming technique. Or maybe it was mostly terrestrial and dipped into the water only to feed, like some weird dream cormorant creature. We certainly do know that they fed underwater because we have fossils of Tanystropheus preserved with squid beaks as stomach content. My personal view of how this animal may have lived is closer to this reconstruction by this incredible artist friend of mine, Brian Chu. I personally think that Tanystropheus was well able to dwell on land and had terrestrial adaptations, but it voluntarily chose to live on the seashore. And something many artists don't show is the possibility that it may have existed in the seashore in massive numbers. So imagine a forest of long necks like this with smaller juveniles sheltering between them. They're just standing there. Every now and then one dips into the sea, maybe to swim, maybe just to pluck its neck in, and out it comes with a squid or another bottom-dwelling animal. Maybe they also swam like proper swimming marine reptiles every now and then and feasted on free-swimming squid and fish, or maybe even smaller marine reptiles. Another possibility I'll just throw out there is a lifestyle as a sort of scuba neck grazer. So imagine when you go scuba diving, okay? You're swimming about, and below you, among the seaweed, the corals, the sea bottom, you see a lot of animals that are just crawling about, swimming, clambering about and doing their own thing. Well, wouldn't it be great if you had some sort of extensible claw to catch them with? And wouldn't it be great if this claw was your neck? I personally suspect this is what Tanystropheus did. It clambered about in the sea bottom and used its neck to graze on the small animals which could not escape it because they were probably too slow. Also, it's very possible that this animal occupied different ecological niches as it grew. Maybe as a youngster they were far more active and they were nimble swimmers. As they grow older, they adapt this clambering lifestyle and start to graze among the little animals that live on the seafloor or among what passed for coral reefs back in that day. But what do you think? How do you think Tanystropheus lived and fed? Come on, people, come on now. If you can't donate to me on Patreon, at least try answering my engagement bait questions so we take this channel towards better pastures. Anyways, that was that for Tanystropheus. Now we are moving towards the tail end of this probably artificial classification scheme, and we have Sclerostropheus, another related species known only from a poorly preserved set of 4 elongated Tanystropheus-like vertebra, and I'm just gonna say it, I think this was just another Tanystropheus. But then again, Tanystropheus as a genus existed for tens of millions of years, and with the rates of fossil preservation, we could be confident that there were dozens, probably hundreds of species of this thing throughout that genus's natural history. And imagine what wonders we are missing out in isolated islands, specific niches, or other lost habitats. Just dream about it. Maybe there were some Madagascar equivalents of the Triassic era where the Tanystrophiids had very colorful necks. Maybe they were highly terrestrial forms or highly aquatic forms and anything and everything in between. Such a wonderful thing to imagine, don't you think? Anyways, moving on, our second to last species is one that proves this evolutionary speculation. We have Ozimec volans, and if it is indeed a relative of Tanystropheus and friends, it shows that this lineage was extremely diverse in the habitats and lifestyles it occupied, because Ozimec had its 4 limbs encased in this strange, almost box-like set of clavicles, suggesting that it could do something really weird and active with them, maybe even flap them. This is partially why the genus is named Ozimec volans, with the species name volans, meaning flying. There's a very high probability that it actively flapped its 4 limbs, but probably was in all likelihood flightless, and its rear limbs may have anchored some sort of a gliding membrane, much like the equally strange but unrelated Charopteryx mirabilis. And finally, in our family tree, we have the American genus Tanitrachelos, hailing from the state of Virginia, and it is represented by many fossils like this one. Tanitrachelos lived in a lake-type environment, and in real life was also pretty cute, and would once again be a likely contender for a profile video at the Clint's Reptiles YouTube channel. And that is that, everybody. Or is it? Because As I've been telling you over and over again, this family tree is probably artificial. That is to say, it groups things together that are not actually related in that order. I've just been using it for convenience, but in Wikipedia there's also this cladogram which arranges these animals in a manner which I find more plausible. In this other cladogram, Dinocephalosaurus is an outlier next to pectodents, and these guys are more marine adapted forms belonging to this lineage, which otherwise had more lightly built semi-terrestrial forms. But as I told you in the very beginning of this podcast, we don't have any genetic data and only weird scatterings of morphological measurements to build these trees with. So once again, if you watch this video 2 years later after I published it in September 2025, the family tree may have changed once again, and in fact different things may have been related to completely different lineages, and it was just a big hazy ibuprofen nightmare of convergent evolution. Also, a side note on researching underrepresented prehistoric reptile genera in general is to be watchful for these two websites, reptileevolution.com and the Pterosaur Heresies WordPress blog. These two websites contain mountains upon mountains of incredibly well executed anatomical drawings and a lot of data, and at first sight you can be forgiven for thinking that they were authoritative and real. Well, the reality of the matter is, once you start looking at them closer, you will see that these websites contain some really strange ideas. For example, here you see a proposal suggesting that some Tanystrophids were related to lizards, out of all things. And despite being lizards, the Tanystrophids Macrocnemus and the probably related form Jesairosaurus here have been reconstructed with strange, almost bird-like filaments. What the hell is going on in here? Well, the truth of the matter is all these websites and all of their content comes from a single very eccentric and, let us just say, renegade researcher. I mean, I, out of all people, would never condemn people for having unorthodox opinions, but suffice it to say that the ideas advanced by this author, David Peters, must be taken with a lot of grains of salt. What he does is he individually studies every fossil from photos and uses strange sharpening filters and claims to see features that nobody else can see. He also has these unique family trees built and encoded with strange characters, and he regularly advances relationships that no other author or researcher has been able to prove. For example, he believes that Tanystrophids are proper lizards, and some of them evolved feathers, which later gave rise to forms like Longisquama, which ultimately gave rise to pterosaurs. Now, if you know anything about paleontology, this is a very surrealistic and outlandish claim. But that is that. I could say a lot more about reptile evolution, pterosaur heresies, and the strange, unmentionable work of David Peters, but then it would be going too far off the topic. That has been that, everybody. This was the CM Kozeman deep dive into Tanysauria and the wonders and miracles and the strange parade of oddities represented in their evolutionary diversity. I hope you enjoyed this video. And once again, if you watched this far, please comment, I have seen the long-necked ones. I have seen the long-necked ones. Please comment, I have seen the long-necked ones. Now I am mentally conditioning you to comment so I can tell who watched this presentation all the way, and we all know who's a real G and not a quitter. Once again, if you enjoy this podcast and everything else I do on this channel, please consider supporting me on Patreon. Patreon is not a one-way street. If you support me there, you also get a lot of extra content, including the downloadable MP3 files for this very podcast. That's been that, everybody. Thanks for watching, and wherever you are, I love you all. Until the next time, have a lovely day. Goodbye.